Moving on to chapter 9. So chapter 9 is dense, okay? It's very, very dense. And I'm sure that for many of you, you found some familiarity with some of the stories from the Old Testament and referencing Adam and Eve and referencing how, thinking about Taker mythology is often wrapped up with these stories that again, and I'm using that term stories very particularly here, right? Where when we think about stories as this embracing of humans in a relationship with God and the world, and these stories that we enact to try to see to become the case, right? And so I'm sure that many of us are familiar with, in some capacity, whether it's peripheral, but we're familiar with, to some extent, these biblical stories, right? And you can see that I have a link on the same page here for a more detailed account of the Cain and Abel story, which if you're interested in kind of looking at that, feel free to, because it does play a major role here later on in chapter 9. And I'm going to jump around quite a bit in chapter 9 and essentially, thinking about this timeline that Ishmael gives here, okay, where he has this focus, where, we're working on the same lineage here, literally the line, the lineage, and then all of a sudden takers have an offshoot, okay? And Ishmael goes through, again, kind of a lot of importance perhaps of the interrelationship between God, about Adam and Eve, and the significance of those stories, and then ultimately comes to Cain and Abel in section, 9, I think? Pardon me. Section 9, section 10, okay? And what's happening here, right? What's happening on this kind of like recognizing the story of Cain and Abel is Cain and Abel being descendants of Adam and Eve, right? And essentially, one of them being a farmer and one of them being like a herder, right? And the other one being, in desire for more land, more conquest, okay? And so we see this representation here, Cain and Abel, where, again, ultimately, as many are familiar with the story, Cain kills Abel, okay? Now, what we see here is at the very end of section 9 in chapter 9, yada, yada, yada. We're thinking about borders. We're thinking about kind of the Fertile Crescent. Again, there's a lot going on here in chapter 9, but I think it's important to bring up here Cain and Abel, where Ishmael nodded toward the Bibles at my feet. Read the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis, and then you'll know. I picked up the one on top, turned to chapter 4, and a couple of moments later I muttered, "Good Lord." After reading the story in all three versions, I looked up and said, what was happening along the border was that Cain was killing Abel. The tillers of the soil were watering their fields with blood of Semitic herders. Of course. What was happening there was what has always happened along borders of taker expansion. The leavers were being killed off so that more land could be put under cultivation. Ishmael picked up his pad, opened his map to the period, and you see these agriculturists have swarmed the entire area except for the territory occupied by the Semites. Here at the border rate that separates the tillers of the soil from Semitic herders, Cain and Abel confront each other. Okay? And so again, excuse me, and so what we see is, again, this kind of representation here, right? This representation, and we see this kind of map here represented on, for me, it's page 174. It's right above section 11. But again, this border that existed between the Semites and the agriculturists, right? And Ishmael is using the Cain and Abel story as, again, representation of what's happening when two different ideologies confront one another, right? And then ultimately, right, on the bottom 174, right before section 11 for me, That's right. If you read the story that originated among your own culture's ancestors, it's incomprehensible. It only begins to make sense when you realize that it originated among the enemies of your cultural ancestors. Yes, I sat there blinking for a few moments, then I looked at Ishmael's map again. If the tillers of the soil from the north were Caucasians, I said, then the mark of Cain is this, and I pointed to my own fair maggot-colored face. It could be, Ishmael said. Obviously, we'll never know what the authors of the story had in mind, but it makes sense this way. The mark was given to Cain as a warning to others. Leave this human alone. This is certainly a dangerous human, one who enacts sevenfold vengeance. Certainly a lot of people all over the world have learned that it doesn't pay to mess with people with white faces. Ishmael shrugged, unconvinced or perhaps just uninterested. But nevertheless, I think that takeaway, right, of this kind of, relationship between the Caucasus region that we're kind of talking about, but then also just kind of referencing, this intensity of this story that we do kind of see, again, this budding up of whenever a taker wants more land, they're going to do damn well whatever they can to try to get it, right? And if we trace this back to the separation between Cain and Abel, right, we still are left in this space of takers, right, and Cain essentially being the first kind of taker to really promote and really kind of offshoot this lever mentality. And in section 14 and 15, right, we talked a little bit more about Adam and a little bit more about Eve. They make the recognition that Eve means life, and so the fact that Adam was tempted by life might have some significance here. And again, just kind of continuing on in section 9 where there is so much richness, but ultimately I'm going to leave that for you all to dive into, or if you're lucky enough to have class, we can kind of dive into sections that might be more important. But I think the Cain and Abel representation is one of the most important ones here, okay, of that entire chapter. In chapter 10, interestingly, we get a bit of a break, and I always think that this is kind of an interesting. Chapter, and I'm just going to show my hand here, right? Like in poker, when you show what you're working with. I think chapter 10 is kind of snuck in there to remind us that the narrator is in fact still a taker. Right? That all this work that the narrator has been doing with Ishmael, all of this kind of, breaking down of concepts, all of this dismantling of ways of thinking, still, we're left here with the narrator existing in taker culture. Right? An uncle arrives unannounced. The narrator goes to the dentist. He goes back to find, goes, and then ultimately Ishmael isn't in his place, right? And so Ishmael isn't in his normal place. And so what the narrator tries to do is he tries to fix it, right? Like this very kind of taker mentality. If something's broken, if something's wrong, I can fix it. I can take care of it, right? He tracks down Sokolos. He puts an ad in the paper, right? And again, I think that there's, again, some richness here in this text where in the past I used to read this chapter as just a little bit of a segue, but ultimately I think that there is something going on here where we're supposed to be reminded of the fact that even with all of this work that's been done, for the narrator, still, we're takers. We're surrounded by taker mentality. We're surrounded by taker culture, right? Eventually, the narrator finds Ishmael in a menagerie, again, kind of in this helpless situation where it's cold, it's rainy, it's damp. The narrator, again, in a very taker fashion, makes it about him, right? He cares about Ishmael. He wants to make sure that Ishmael's all right, but ultimately, he's like, well, what about me? Where we left off? We got to a really, invigorating point, and then all this happened. What about me? I need to have my fix here, right? I need to have my, I need to have my answers, okay? And so this is kind of how chapter 10 plays out, right? And then in chapter 11, we get to the lever story. And that is where the next videos will take up. And there is something to ask, right? Like, and I think I might ask this in the next video. I can't totally remember. But like, all of this is takers. All of this is levers. So there's really like a big, like if we think about it in page number count, there's a big difference here between how much time is spent on each. And I think there's good reason for that, right? I mean, we spend so much time on the taker story for the fact that we need to really do some work to dive in, to take it apart, right? And then with the lever story, we'll see how that pans out and what we might learn, what we might gain from, again, this kind of perhaps alternative perspective or at least a reframing perspective as levers. Cheers.